Dwayne Johnson appears in American pop culture history as one of the rare success icons who has crossed multiple fields without ever losing his influence. In professional wrestling, he is one of the greatest legends in WWE history. 10-time world champion, 8 WWE championships, and 2 WCW championships, 2-time Intercontinental Champion, 5-time Tag Team Champion, winner of the 2000 Royal Rumble, and one of the rare Triple Crown champions in WWE history. He was the central face of the Attitude Era, the golden period that turned WWE into a global entertainment empire. In 2024, Dwayne Johnson was officially inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, closing out an iconic wrestling journey. Leaving the ring, he conquered Hollywood with a series of billion-dollar blockbusters, becoming one of the highest-paid actors in the world for many consecutive years. As a producer, entrepreneur, and inspirational figure, he was honored by Time as one of the most influential people in the world, the embodiment of the American dream, discipline, willpower, and victory through relentless effort. But right beneath that spotlight lies a quiet, ethical question. When a man has reached every peak that society admires, who still has the calm to ask what price he had to pay for it all? Because running parallel to that brilliant string of achievements is another life, one far quieter and far more brutal. For 30 years, Dwayne Johnson has lived 2 lives at once. One is The Rock, always strong, always victorious, always the mental anchor for millions. And the other is Dwayne, a man who has had to face depression, fear of failure, unstable childhood memories, and the pressure of never being allowed to show weakness. He learned to smile when exhausted inside, to inspire others when he himself was drained, to stand tall in front of the public, while quietly patching every crack in his inner world. His double life isn't about hiding, it's about prolonged endurance, where willpower became his only survival tool. And before Dwayne Johnson could lift others up with his strength and fame, he first had to learn how to pull himself out of invisible abysses, places with no audience, no applause, just one determined man refusing to let himself fall. If you want to keep exploring the lives behind the spotlight of the icons the whole world admires, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this story. The following part will take you deeper into the darkest years Dwayne Johnson ever went through, where strength was no longer about muscles, but about the will to survive. Behind the spotlight of titles and cheers the world sees in Dwayne Johnson, there is a childhood he very rarely mentions as a complete memory. It wasn't the childhood of a kid who got to grow up slowly, with a fixed room, with friends year after year, with a place to call home. Dwayne's childhood was a continuous series of being uprooted, following the aimless travels of a wrestling family living on the road schedule, where the suitcase barely got set down before it had to be dragged away again. Home was just a temporary stop, school was just a passing place, and the feeling of safety never had time to take root. The boy Dwayne grew up in a constant state of readiness to leave, always preparing for the next loss, because life had taught him that nothing stayed long enough to be trusted. In that world, his father, Rocky Johnson, stood as both an admirable and terrifying figure. He was a man from a generation unaccustomed to saying loving words, unaccustomed to hugging his child, unaccustomed to listening to tender anxieties. His love was shown through discipline, through strictness, through the demand to be strong, even before understanding what weakness meant. Dwayne learned very early that to be acknowledged, he had to endure, had to toughen up, had to hide any emotions that didn't fit the image of a wrestler's son. No one told him that fear was normal, that sadness was something children were allowed to feel. Instead, he learned to stay silent. Silent so as not to bother anyone. Silent so as not to become a burden. Silent so he could stay in a world that always carried the risk of abandoning him. The constant moving meant Dwayne never had time to build any lasting connections. Friends came and went like train stations, teachers only remembered him as a name that briefly passed through the class roster. The big, different boy was often the outsider, carrying the feeling that he didn't truly belong anywhere. In a family where the adults were also struggling just to survive, no one had enough time or energy to ask a child how he was feeling. And so, Dwayne grew up on pure instinct for adaptation, on the ability to read the room, on adjusting himself to fit every new situation. There was no real childhood, only early lessons in how to survive. He learned to take responsibility for his own emotions, learned not to wait for anyone to save him, because waiting only brought disappointment. His father's strictness, though not born from malice, deeply engraved in Dwayne a dangerous belief that love always comes with conditions, that to be allowed to stay, to not be abandoned, he had to be strong enough, good enough, quiet enough. It was in that environment that the fear of abandonment quietly took shape and grew, like a shadow that followed him through every stage of life. That fear wasn't loud, didn't spill into tears. It settled into an invisible force that kept pushing Dwayne forward, kept forcing him to prove his worth. He didn't allow himself to stop, because stopping meant the risk of being forgotten. He didn't allow himself weakness, because weakness could make others turn away. A childhood without a safe place taught Dwayne that the world didn't have open arms waiting, and if he wanted to survive, he had to become his own support. From there, the iron will the world later admired began to form not as a gift, but as a survival reflex. Behind the powerful body and confident smile of the grown man is still the image of a little boy who never dared be sure where he would be tomorrow, with whom, or whether he would still be accepted. And it was that persistent, quiet fear of abandonment that became the painful foundation, shaping every choice, every effort, and the way Dwayne Johnson learned to live two lives at once for decades to come. The fear of abandonment formed in those years without a safe place had barely settled when life forced Dwayne Johnson to face an event that, even many decades later, still slows his voice and darkens his eyes whenever he mentions it. That year, Dwayne was only 15, the age when a kid should only be worried about school, friends, and vague dreams. But in a home always tense from money problems, endless travel, a strict father, and a mother who had been carrying too much for too long, the atmosphere had become so heavy there was no room left for carefreeness. Dwayne's mother, Atta Johnson, the one person who had been his only anchor in an unstable childhood, began slipping into a deep depression that no one in the family truly understood or named correctly. She became quieter, her eyes emptier, and exhaustion weighed down her every ordinary movement. For a boy already used to observing in order to survive, Dwayne sensed something was cracking, but he had no words to name it, and no one had taught him what to do when the adults started to collapse. That day unfolded like any other. No warning, no clear signs, just an afternoon, when the air in the house grew so suffocating it was hard to breathe. When Dwayne realized his mother stepped outside in an abnormal state, he instinctively knew something was wrong. And then, amid the rushing traffic on the highway, the moment a 15-year-old boy would never forget took place. Atta Johnson stepped off the shoulder and walked toward the moving lanes, as if she no longer had the strength to keep existing in this world. There was no scream, no explanation, just a silent action carrying the full despair of someone who had borne too much. Dwayne didn't cry. He didn't have time to panic the way a child might. His body reacted before his mind could even process what was happening. He ran after her, grabbed his mother, pulled her back, using every ounce of strength a growing teenager had, not like a hero, but like a terrified son facing the prospect of being left alone. When they finally stood safely on the shoulder again, Dwayne didn't scream or collapse. He just shook from shock. Shook from realizing how razor-thin the line was between having and losing. In that moment, a brutal truth carved itself into his young mind. Strength isn't always enough to save the people you love. He could pull his mother back from the traffic that day, but he couldn't pull her out of the darkness in her mind. And that made Dwayne understand a lesson many men only realize too late. There are pains that muscles, willpower, or toughness simply cannot reach. The boy stood beside his mother, hands still trembling, and for the first time in his life, he felt helpless in a deep, complete, and terrifying way. No one told him how much this would haunt him. No one taught him how to handle that shock. The family kept living, kept moving, kept surviving as if nothing had happened because in their world, stopping to face pain was a luxury. But for Dwayne, from that second onward, everything had changed. He carried the image of his mother stepping into highway traffic like a wound that would never heal. Every time she went quiet, he grew tense. Every time she seemed sad, he grew afraid. And because he didn't know how to express it, didn't know how to ask, he chose the only way he knew, to become stronger. Not to be admired, but to control the fear of losing one more time. From then on, Dwayne began to believe that if he was strong enough, steady enough, reliable enough, then the people he loved wouldn't leave. That belief both helped him survive and quietly imprisoned him in a harsh cycle. He wouldn't allow himself weakness, because in his mind, weakness meant danger. It meant not being able to protect the ones he loved. The event at 15 was never reported in the press, never became an inspirational story at the time, but it became the core crack in Dwayne Johnson's being. From that crack, two parallel paths slowly formed. One path was the Rock, the man who always stood firm, always smiled, always inspired, always said everything could be overcome with enough effort. The other path was Dwayne, the son, who once trembled on the highway shoulder, carrying the fear of losing his mother, his family, everything fragile he had tried so hard to hold on to. Those two paths didn't separate, they intertwined, overlapped, creating a double life no one could see. And from that moment, Dwayne's will was no longer simply the desire for success. It became a survival mechanism, a silent promise the little boy once made to himself, that he would never allow himself to fall, because if he fell, there would be no one left strong enough to hold on to the people he loved. After the incident at 15 years old, when the boy Dwayne realized that strength couldn't always save the people he loved, life seemed to leave him with only one way out: football. For Dwayne Johnson at that time, football wasn't just a sport. It was structure. It was discipline. It was the place where he could pour all his fear, anger, and insecurity into physical movement. On the field, he didn't need to talk. He didn't need to explain. He just had to charge, collide, take the pain, and keep getting back up. In a world where emotions were seen as weakness, football gave him a legitimate way to survive without having to admit he was breaking inside. He believed that if he was good enough, strong enough, tough enough, football would open the door out of those unstable years, out of the fear of abandonment, and most importantly, give him a clear identity: a player, a warrior, someone who had value. Dwayne entered the University of Miami with the hunger of a young man carrying the entire hope of his life on his shoulders. There, football wasn't just a personal passion, it was a collective dream, a pre-paved path for anyone talented enough to keep going. He trained like a madman, pushed his body past its limits, as if every practice was another proof that he deserved to stay. But life doesn't run on the logic of pure effort alone. Injury struck without warning, cutting off the rhythm he had poured all his faith into. From a promising player, Dwayne was gradually pushed to the sidelines, not because he lacked will, but because his body could no longer meet the harshest demands. He watched his spot get filled by others younger, healthier, less injured. No one said he had failed, but every sign showed he was no longer needed. That moment felt like a silent sentence. The first identity Dwayne had tried to build with all his fear and determination began to collapse. Football, the thing he believed was his only escape, slowly became a door closing shut. There was no farewell ceremony, no recognition for the years he had given, just the feeling of being written out of a story he thought he was the main character in. For a young man raised in an environment where self-worth was tied tightly to strength and endurance, being pushed out meant losing his reason to exist. Dwayne didn't know what to call that feeling. He only knew that every morning he woke up, the belief that once lifted him was no longer there. No one teaches young men how to face failure. No one tells them that some dreams shatter, not because of lack of effort, but because life is simply cruel. Instead of being allowed to feel sad or lost, Dwayne learned to swallow everything inside. He didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't ask for help, because in the world he grew up in, those weren't options. He carried the disappointment like a heavy weight on his chest, but he kept moving, kept pretending he was okay. When the NFL door didn't open, he turned to the Canadian Football League as a last chance, a desperate attempt to hold on to an identity that was already shaking. But even there, history repeated itself. There was no place for him to stay, no promised future. The football dream ended not with a dramatic fall, but with a quiet sidelining. It was during that period that depression began creeping into Dwayne's life in the quietest and most dangerous way. There was no clear breakdown, no dramatic signs, just an emptiness that slowly spread wider. He started doubting his own worth, doubting every choice he'd made, and most importantly, doubting whether he even had a reason to keep trying. When that first identity died young, Dwayne stood in a void no one had prepared him for. He was no longer a player. He wasn't anything else yet. Just a young man with a tired body, a frayed spirit, and a blurry future. Those days, he felt like he was drifting no direction, no anchor, while the world around him kept moving as if his loss didn't matter at all. The failure in football didn't just take away a potential career. It took away the belief that if you tried hard enough, everything would be rewarded. It forced Dwayne to face a truth he was never ready to accept. Sometimes you do everything right, and you still lose. And when that happens, no one teaches you how to keep living. It was from here that Dwayne's double life began to shift into a new form. On the outside, he still tried to appear strong, still kept the calm needed so his family wouldn't worry. But inside, a silent war was raging, a place where he had to learn to survive without a map, without a clear role, and without anyone telling him he still deserved to be here. Football, once the place he poured all his hope into, became a painful memory, reminding him that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and that the deepest wounds sometimes don't come from hits on the field, but from the moment you realize your only dream has been taken away without leaving behind a single explanation. After the football door closed for the second time, this time permanently, Dwayne Johnson's life fell to a point he later called his absolute lowest. The Canadian Football League didn't keep him. No promises, no future, no next path laid out. When it all ended, Dwayne stood there like a man who had just been pushed out of his own life, empty-handed, identity hollowed out, and a void he couldn't name. In his pocket at that moment, he had only $7. Not $7 as some inspirational anecdote to be told later, but $7 belonging to a young man who didn't know how he would survive tomorrow. The amount was so small, it wasn't enough for a decent meal, but it was enough to remind him that he had fallen to the lowest point a person could reach and still be standing. No money meant no choices. No choices meant being trapped inside his own mind. Dwayne came back in silence. No victories to brag about. No failures to explain. Just a vague shame he didn't know where to put. He avoided other people's eyes. Avoided casual questions like, "So what are you gonna do now?" Because he had no answer. In those days, the world around him kept going. Old friends moved forward while he stood still, as if time had forgotten to take him along. The loneliness didn't come from having no one around. It came from the feeling of no longer belonging anywhere. Dwayne isolated himself, not because he hated anyone, but because he didn't have the strength to pretend he was okay anymore. Mornings started to feel heavy. Waking up was no longer the start of a new day. It was a task to be completed. There were days he didn't want to open his eyes, because opening them meant facing a reality with no shape, no direction. Depression didn't arrive like a storm. It came like thick fog, seeping into every thought, making everything slow and meaningless. Dwayne couldn't name his state. He only knew the energy had drained away. The belief that once held him up had vanished, and the question, "What am I even here for?" started showing up more often. No one saw it, because on the outside, he still maintained the calm he needed, still tried to look strong the way life had taught him since he was a kid. It was during this period that Dwayne's first double life truly took shape. On the outside, he kept a stable shell. No complaining, no crying for help, no showing the confusion. He understood that in the world of men he grew up in, admitting you were falling apart wasn't acceptable, but inside, everything was shattering. He felt like he had done everything right and still lost, and that made him question his entire value. He once believed effort would always be rewarded, that strength and discipline were enough to overcome anything, but harsh reality taught him something else. Sometimes you give everything, and you're still not chosen. Those days, Dwayne lived in prolonged silence. No cheers, no training schedules, no clear goals. Just hours alone with his thoughts, where memories of an unstable childhood, the fear of losing his mom, and the shattered football dream piled on top of each other. He began wondering if he was a burden to his family, if his existence meant anything to anyone. Those questions were never spoken, but they wore him down from the inside, bit by bit. There were nights he lay awake for hours, not from physical pain, but because his mind wouldn't let him rest. Yet right there at the bottom, something fragile but crucial began to form. Not grand hope, not shining belief, just a very small survival reflex. He still got up every day, even though he didn't know where he was going. Dwayne had no plan, no long-term vision, only a quiet decision, not giving up today. That decision didn't come from optimism. It came from the fear that, if he let go, he would lose himself completely. The $7 in his pocket became a cruel but necessary reminder that he had nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing left to lose, sometimes continuing to exist is the bravest act. This period didn't create legends, didn't bring achievements, and wasn't recorded in any highlight reel, but it laid the foundation for everything that would come later. Dwayne learned how to endure emptiness without looking for an instant escape, learned how to stay with the pain without letting it swallow him whole, and most importantly, learned how to live two lives at once. An outside life, where he tried to keep a stable image so others wouldn't worry, and an inside life, where he fought every day with the question of whether he should keep existing at all. That was the first double life, raw and painful. No light, no audience, but it was from that place where it seemed there was nothing left that Dwayne Johnson began to form a different kind of will. One not based on victory or identity, but on the ability to stay with life, even when life gave no clear reason to keep going. From the bottom of $7 in mornings he didn't want to wake up for, Dwayne Johnson stepped into WWE, not with the burning flame of passion people often imagine, but with a much simpler and far more brutal need. He needed a place to take shelter. Wrestling came to him like a half-open door in the middle of a downpour, not promising glory, only promising one thing. If he could stand on that stage, he wouldn't have to face the silence of himself. WWE gave him a schedule, gave him rules, gave him a clear role in a world where everything else was blurry. There, no one asked if he was okay. They only asked if he was ready to step into the lights. And he was ready, because stepping into the lights was always easier than standing still in the dark. The Rock was born not as a childhood dream nurtured over time, but as a survival instinct. Dwayne began building his body, the way people build fortress walls. Every hour of training was a brick, every drop of sweat, a layer of mortar, sealing the cracks inside. His muscles grew day by day, while his emotions were forced to shrink, compressed so tightly it became hard to breathe. He learned to turn pain into motion, fear into strength, chaos into discipline. On the wrestling floor, everything had rhythm. Strike, take the hit, get back up. There, pain had rules, and a clear ending completely unlike the invisible pains of real life. The WWE stage quickly became the perfect curtain to hide behind. Under the lights, he was allowed to be loud, allowed to be aggressive, allowed to be the version the world wanted to see. The cheers rose like waves, drowning out the weary voice inside. Every performance night was a temporary escape from the question, "Who am I when I have no identity?" Because here, the identity was handed to him ready-made. The Rock strong, confident, unbeatable. He clung to that role not because it made him happy, but because it kept him standing. When the crowd chanted his name, he knew he existed in a way no one could deny. But every mask has its price. The more he was celebrated, the more he had to keep the mask from slipping. The stronger he appeared in public, the less space he had to be weak when alone. Dwayne learned to smile at the right moments, say the right confident lines, walk with unwavering posture while inside. The fear of abandonment quietly took deeper root. He didn't dare stop, because stopping meant the mask might crack. And if the mask cracked, everything he had used to stay upright all this time could come crashing down. So he kept moving forward, kept training, kept performing not out of love, but because he didn't yet know how to live without it. The cheers became painkillers, effective, but short-term. When the show ended, when the locker room door closed, when his body began to ache in the silence, the old questions returned. He faced himself in the mirror, seeing a massive body and an emptiness that was hard to name. But instead of stopping to listen, he chose the only thing he knew: get bigger, faster, stronger. Every extra pound added to the barbell, he believed he had pushed the darkness back just a little more. WWE didn't just give him a job, it gave him a role to hide behind. In that role, he didn't have to talk about depression, didn't have to admit exhaustion, didn't have to ask permission to rest. He just had to step out, do exactly what the audience expected, and receive recognition like a clear transaction. That was the comfort real life had never given him. But at the same time, it reinforced a dangerous habit, equating his self-worth with his ability to perform. When he performed well, he existed. When he slowed down, the fear returned. The Rock was therefore both salvation and shackles. Salvation because it pulled Dwayne out of the directionless abyss. Shackles because it taught him that to be allowed to stay, he had to be stronger than yesterday. His body became a fortress, but that fortress had no windows. Little light got in, and little emotion got out. He learned to live to the rhythm of the crowd, so he wouldn't have to hear his own heartbeat pounding in quiet nights. And so, the double life moved into a new chapter. On the outside, The Rock grew bigger every day, confident, charismatic, full of power. On the inside, Dwayne shrank back, cautious, exhausted, always on guard against collapse. Those two lives ran parallel, feeding each other in a contradictory way. The light helped hide the darkness, while the darkness pushed him to seek more light. The cheers kept drowning out the inner voice, and he allowed it to happen, because at that point, silence was still the thing he feared most. When The Rock stood at the peak of WWE, the world saw a perfect victory, while Dwayne Johnson began entering his darkest phase in a very different way. The darkness didn't leave when the brightest lights appeared. Fame arrived like a flood, sweeping him onto packed stages, global broadcasts, slogans that rang so loud it seemed there was no room left for doubt. WWE at that time was absolute peak, and The Rock was at the center of the storm. Every night, every match. Every time the microphone was handed to him, the cheers rose like an affirmation that everything was in its right place, that this man had found his destiny. But right behind the curtain, where the lights didn't reach, no victory was allowed to rest. Fame didn't come with peace. It came with brutal pace. Overlapping schedules, endless travel, short nights strung together by early flights, training sessions stretched beyond endurance. His body was pushed to the limit, while his mind was forced to stand tall, because in the world of icons, there was no room for fatigue. The Rock wasn't allowed to sleep enough, wasn't allowed to stop, wasn't allowed to feel for too long. He learned to live in a state suspended between alert and exhaustion, where adrenaline replaced sleep, where the roar of the crowd became a second heartbeat. The stage lights were so bright, they blurred every crack. But backstage was cold. Cold in the most human sense. Silent locker rooms, long hallways, moments alone amid the crowd. There, he faced his own face, sweaty, tired, but still had to smile when the door opened. He understood that the role didn't end when the match ended. The role only paused when no one was watching. And even then, he didn't dare remove the mask, because removing it meant having to hear the inner voice, and that voice had been too loud since those earlier years. The more he was loved, the more he was bound. The more he was celebrated, the less space he had to fall. Fame, instead of soothing the fear of abandonment, unintentionally fed it, because now the fear wasn't, "Will I be accepted?" It was, "Will I still be loved if I slow down?" So he chose the only way he knew: speed up, train harder, perform stronger, speak more firmly, smile wider. On the outside, The Rock became the embodiment of unshakable confidence. On the inside, Dwayne learned to shrink his emotions so they wouldn't break the schedule. Sleepless nights followed one after another, not from physical pain, but because his mind wouldn't settle. When the cheers faded, the old questions returned. If one day I'm no longer The Rock, who will I be? If the lights go out, who will stay? He didn't answer those questions. He worked to overpower them. Work became the painkiller, effective but short-term. Whenever the pace slowed, the emptiness surfaced, and he hurriedly threw himself into the next whirl. It was during this period that the two parallel lives began to solidify. The first life belonged to the public. The Rock, strong, witty, never backing down, the one lifting the spirits of millions struggling with themselves. The second life belonged to silence. Dwayne, exhausted, wary, always on guard against collapse, the one who had to carry his own cracks without being allowed to name them. Those two lives didn't outwardly contradict. They supplemented each other in a cruel way. The brighter the light, the deeper the darkness. And he survived by keeping that boundary from being exposed. Fame also brought a very specific kind of loneliness. Not loneliness from lack of people around, but from lack of people who could truly see him. People saw The Rock, saw the victories, saw the smile. Few saw the man standing backstage, taking a deep breath before stepping out, as if every appearance was a moment of gathering broken pieces so no one would notice. He became a support for so many people that he forgot he might need support himself. But icons aren't allowed to ask. At WWE's peak, success was no longer the goal. Maintaining it became the burden. Every time he stepped out, he had to be perfect. Perfect role, perfect timing, perfect expectations. There was no space for mistakes, and even less for weakness. And so, instead of living, he operated. Instead of feeling, he completed. Day after day. That chain of completions built an empire while eroding a man. Fame arrived, but the darkness didn't leave. It stood there, patient, waiting for the rare moments when the lights went out earlier than expected. And each time that happened, he chose the old way: charge forward. Because in the world he was living in, stopping wasn't rest. Stopping was facing it. And facing it, at that point, was still something he wasn't ready to do. When the boundaries of WWE became too narrow for the stature the world was assigning to The Rock, Hollywood opened like a new peak of light, and Dwayne Johnson stepped into it with an image so polished it was nearly seamless. Blockbuster after blockbuster, global box offices welcomed him as the ideal American man. Strong, funny, upright, never falling to adversity. On screen, he saved the world, protected families, defeated evil. In real life, he walked red carpets with the familiar smile, the firm handshake, the motivational lines quoted millions of times. Hollywood didn't just need Dwayne Johnson. Hollywood needed the icon he represented, and he understood that. At that point, the smile was no longer a natural reflex. It was part of the job. Always smile, because that's what people expected. Always inspire, because millions were waiting for one of his words to keep trying. He became the voice of resilience in a weary world, the face invited to speak about hope, discipline, never giving up. But while he kept reminding others that everything will be okay, no one stopped to ask him a simple question. Are you okay? That question didn't appear in quick interviews, had no place in the packed schedule, and seemed somehow unfit for the image he carried. Hollywood pushed the mask to its most perfect level. Not just The Rock as strong, but Dwayne Johnson as complete. Top actor, successful businessman, exemplary father, national inspiration. Every role demanded full presence, and he tried to meet them all because stopping meant letting the emptiness show. But that emptiness was still there, growing clearer every time the lights went out and the room grew quiet. The loneliness of an icon isn't like ordinary loneliness. It doesn't come from having no one around. It comes from no one staying long enough to see the person behind the image. Long filming schedules, flight after flight, hotel after hotel. He grew used to waking up in a different place every week, used to small talk that never touched anything real. Work kept him from having to listen to himself, but it also took away the moments needed to recover. His body kept enduring. His mind kept functioning, while emotions were set aside like something luxurious with no place left in this life. He learned to control everything, from schedules to image, because even one small slip could cause the machine called icon to malfunction. The contradiction became clearer than ever. The higher he climbed, the harder it was to touch the ground. Success didn't bring a sense of safety. It created a new pressure, to always be worthy of that position. Hollywood loved him for his reliability, for his ability to guarantee box office numbers, for an image free of scandal. But that very stability made him feel like he was living inside a mold he wasn't allowed to break. He wasn't allowed to show sadness publicly, wasn't allowed to hesitate, wasn't allowed to admit that sometimes even he didn't know where he was going. In the rare moments alone, the old question returned, only this time in a different form. If everything is succeeding like this and I still feel empty, then where's the problem? He had no answer. Instead of searching, he kept doing the one thing that had helped him survive for so many years. Move forward. New project, new role, new challenge. Every step forward was a step of avoidance, and he accepted that because avoidance was still better than facing it when he wasn't ready. Hollywood, with all its glamour, became the clearest mirror reflecting the double life Dwayne was living. One life in front of the cameras, where he was the embodiment of belief and strength. One life behind closed doors, where he carried the accumulated exhaustion from years of not being allowed to be weak. Those two lives coexisted, feeding each other in a paradoxical way. The light helped him hide the darkness, while the darkness pushed him to seek more light. The loneliness of an icon isn't loud. It doesn't explode, doesn't collapse, it simmers, persistent. It's present in sleepless nights, in long flights, staring out at pitch-black windows, in moments standing in front of the mirror, wondering whether that smile still belongs to him or is just part of the role. But even then, he still stepped out, still fulfilled his duty to the world, because at the peak of public life, he no longer represented only himself, he represented millions who believed in the story he was telling. And so, the perfect mask remained intact, while inside, Dwayne Johnson quietly carried an inner core that had never truly been touched. After the years when Hollywood pushed the mask to its most perfect level, Dwayne Johnson's personal life entered an event that wasn't loud, wasn't sensational, but deep enough to change the way he saw himself. His first marriage ended in silence. No scandal, no accusations, no tabloids chasing every detail of their private lives. Just two people who had stood beside each other for a very long time, suddenly realizing they were heading in different directions and no longer had the strength to pull each other back. In a world where breakups are usually told with shouting, their breakup happened very differently, quietly, slowly, and painful in the way grown-up Americans do it, painful but without making noise. Dwayne and Danny Garcia had once been a special couple. They met when there were no Hollywood lights yet, when everything was still fragile and unshaped. Danny wasn't just a wife. She was the person who walked with him through the hardest times, who witnessed the days when he had nothing in his hands but willpower. They built a life based on partnership and reality, not on glamour. But when Dwayne's career exploded, their rhythms began to drift apart. One lived in an increasingly packed schedule, the other carried the home front and strategic roles. There was no wrong, just different. And different for long enough becomes distance. Their divorce didn't come from a single explosive moment, it came from accumulated exhaustion. Two mature people realized that love was no longer enough to make up for life's new demands. No one betrayed anyone. No one hurt anyone on purpose. It was just that when one person had to keep moving forward, keep upholding the icon image, while the other needed more presence, the gap slowly opened. And once that gap formed, it wasn't easy to fill with promises. The most painful thing wasn't losing each other, it was losing a version of himself. For Dwayne, that marriage was tied to the part of his life when he wasn't yet a global icon, wasn't yet the person always expected to be strong for others. When it ended, he didn't just lose a life partner, he lost the feeling of being himself without needing a mask. But he didn't allow himself to complain. He didn't blame the work, the fame, or anyone else. Because deep down, he understood that this was one of the prices of living two lives at once. The breakup happened so quietly that many outsiders didn't notice it right away. There were no public arguments, no emotional status updates. The two chose to preserve respect because even though the marriage ended, their connection didn't completely disappear. They remained family in a different sense, still shared responsibilities, still looked to the future with cold but necessary realism. That very civility made the pain harder to name because there was no villain to hate, no simple story to retell, just the empty feeling of accepting that one chapter of life had closed with no winner and no loser. For Dwayne, this was the first time he faced a failure that couldn't be fixed with strength or discipline. There was no workout to patch this void, no schedule to cover the sense of loss, and no crowd to drown out the silence when he came home. He kept working, kept appearing, kept fulfilling the roles the world expected. On the outside, everything still ran smoothly. On the inside, a part of him began learning to accept that some things, no matter how hard you try, can't be held onto. This was the kind of pain that doesn't make you collapse right away, it makes you go quiet. No sobbing, no breakdown, just sudden moments of realizing you're alone in a new way, evenings with no one waiting, conversations that end earlier, decisions you have to make alone without a partner to discuss them. Dwayne didn't talk much about this period because he wasn't used to sharing emotional failures, but that very silence showed the depth of the wound. This wasn't pain that needed to be proven. It was pain that had to be carried. In that context, his double life shifted shape once again. In public, he remained the model of a steady, calm man who never let personal emotions affect his work. Behind closed doors, he began to understand that always being strong could cause people to lose the ability to connect, not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of space for weakness. The failed marriage became the clearest mirror, reflecting that paradox. No one yelled. No one was blamed. Just two grown people choosing to let go with respect, and one man learning another hard lesson. Not every loss comes from a mistake, and not every effort leads to a perfect ending. Grown-up American pain is like that: no audience needed, no noise required, just enough silence for each person to carry their share and keep living. After the quiet, no-yelling divorce, Dwayne Johnson's life entered a silent but decisive moral turning point: fatherhood. Not just in name, but in the daily responsibility of showing up. If there was one fear that followed him more persistently than failure or poverty, it was the fear of becoming the cold version of the father he had spent his childhood trying to understand. Dwayne knew very well what it felt like to grow up under strict discipline, under conditional love, with nods instead of hugs. And he told himself, almost like an unspoken vow, that the cycle had to stop with him. Fatherhood forced him to face things fame had never demanded. On stage or in front of cameras, he could control everything: rhythm, words, image. But with his children, there was no role, no script, no cheers to drown out the silences. There, it was only presence or absence. Dwayne understood that if he kept living at the pace of an icon, he might unintentionally recreate exactly what had hurt him: a father who was always busy, always strong, but never there when needed. And that fear made him slow down an action that felt almost unnatural to someone who had spent years accelerating. He began learning things that seemed simple but had never been taught: hug, speak, stay. Hug not to comfort others, but to allow himself to soften. Speak not in slogans, but in real words: sorry when wrong, admitting when tired. Stay not just being on the schedule, but being in the moment, putting the phone down, listening fully to a small story. Those things didn't come naturally. They had to be trained like muscles, but in the opposite direction: let go more, slow down more, lighten up more. Family gradually became the only true refuge, not a place to escape to, but a place where he learned to return to his real self. There, he didn't need to be the rock, didn't need to prove anything, just needed to be Dwayne, the father who could be tired, could be worried, could not know the answer to everything. He realized a bitter paradox: to protect the people you love, sometimes you don't need more strength, you need presence. And that presence demanded courage no less than any match. The courage not to hide in work when emotions got uncomfortable. The courage to stay when silence started speaking louder than words. The decision to father differently also meant resetting boundaries with himself. Dwayne began choosing things that seemed small but carried big, meaning getting home on time, more when possible, prioritizing unseen moments, accepting that missing a career opportunity was sometimes the price to pay to not miss his children's childhood. That wasn't giving up ambition, it was redefining success. Success no longer measured by applause, but by the ability to show up when needed, by the memories his children would carry as they grew up. The fear of repeating his father didn't disappear. It became a guiding compass. Every time he felt himself about to close off, about to use silence instead of connection, that fear pulled him back. It reminded him that love can't exist only in intention. It has to be practiced. And so, he practiced day after day in moments that never made the news, that went unrecognized. That was how he answered the old cracks. Not with grand promises, but with small persistence. In that journey, Dwayne also learned how to forgive not just his father, but himself. He understood that men of the previous generation loved in the way they knew how, and generational wounds often come without malice. The difference lies in whether someone dares to stop the cycle. For him, fatherhood became the central moral act, choosing not to let the pain keep multiplying, choosing presence over absence, choosing to speak instead of staying silent. Family, therefore, wasn't the final reward of success. It became the foundation that let him keep living without losing himself. When the lights went out, when the schedule emptied, when the old questions returned, it was those ordinary evenings, simple meals, hugs with no reason that kept him steady, not as an icon, but as a man learning to love in the way he once lacked. And in that choice, the choice to father differently, Dwayne Johnson found a new strength, quieter, more enduring, and real enough that it didn't need to be hidden. After learning how to show up for his family, Dwayne Johnson faced another raw, non-negotiable truth. The body doesn't lie. The years of wearing the Rock's armor, heavy training, heavy performing, heavy living, had left their marks. It started with dull aches after long shooting days, mornings that required longer warm-ups just to stand straight. Then came injuries that demanded surgery, medical decisions with no more just push through a little longer option. The body, once a loyal ally, began sending clear signals that it had gone beyond its limits. Surgery wasn't a heroic moment. It was an admission that willpower can't replace tendons, bones, joints, an admission that discipline can't patch up the accumulated tears from thousands of lifts, hundreds of non-stop shooting days. Every time he walked into recovery, Dwayne faced a bitter paradox. The very strength that carried him so far was now demanding the highest price. Pain was no longer a tool to overcome. Pain became a warning, and for the first time in many years, he was forced to listen. Chronic pain is a quiet enemy. It doesn't explode, doesn't end neatly. It lives in small movements, bending down, standing up, turning a shoulder. It follows him into sleep, making nights longer, sleep shallower. He once believed enduring was a virtue, that pushing through was duty. But when pain becomes constant, enduring is no longer brave. It becomes denial. And denial, in the end, only prolongs the damage. Strength gradually turned into burden. Muscles, the symbol of capability and power, now required care, recovery, limits. Every training decision had to be weighed carefully. Every action scene needed adjustments, not because he was getting weaker, but because his body had paid enough for the years of never stopping. The hardest part wasn't lowering intensity, it was lowering ego, admitting that some days, the best day is the day you know when to stop. In the quiet periods after surgery, when the schedule was forced to slow, Dwayne saw more clearly the relationship between his body and the double life he had lived. The mask needed a body durable enough to sustain it. When the body began to betray, the mask shook. He could no longer hide exhaustion behind perfectly timed smiles. He could no longer make up for lack of sleep with caffeine and discipline. The body forced him to face what he had once avoided. Limits are real. That realization brought a new fear. Not fear of pain, but fear of losing the familiar means to prove his worth. If he couldn't always be bigger, stronger, who would he be? The question he had once dodged now stood directly in front of him. And this time, he didn't run. He learned to restructure his relationship with himself, train for durability instead of heaviness, make recovery as important as performance, prioritize long-term health over the moment. These things sound obvious, but for someone who had lived by acceleration, it was a conversion. The body's betrayal also carried another moral lesson, setting an example. Dwayne understood that the image he projected wasn't just strength, it was how he treated health. He began speaking more about recovery, about listening to the body, about not treating pain as a medal, not to complain, but to recalibrate the compass for those looking to him. Because if the icon continued to glorify blind endurance, the cycle of injury would continue into the next generation. On the days he couldn't train heavy, he found strength elsewhere, in the patience of slow recovery. In a new discipline, the discipline of resting at the right time. In family, where he wasn't required to prove anything except being there. He realized that the most enduring strength isn't in bulging muscles, but in the ability to change habits when reality shifts. The body won't endure forever, that's a non-negotiable truth. But in that truth, Dwayne found a new kind of freedom. Freedom from always having to tense up to be worthy. Freedom to say enough without calling it failure. Freedom to put health before pace, person before image. And when he accepted the body's limits, paradoxically, he opened a wider space for his inner life, where strength was no longer a burden, but balance. When the body was forced to slow, Dwayne Johnson's inner life had nowhere left to hide. And right at that moment, a late loss arrived. Not loud, not dramatic, but lingering like a wound with no stitches. His father passed away. Rocky Johnson's death didn't just close one life. It closed the chance to say the things he had hesitated on for decades. No more opportunity to ask one more question. No more conversation slow enough to really listen. No more hug to make up for the ones that were missing. This pain didn't explode. It spread. It soaked in. It stayed. Dwayne didn't collapse in public, didn't cry on camera. He did what he always did. Fulfill obligations, keep the rhythm, stand tall. But in the silence, old memories surged: childhood with strict discipline, lessons with little warmth, distances that seemed necessary to become strong. He remembered a father who loved more through actions than words, more through expectations than comfort. And when the end came, he realized there were questions that no longer had anywhere to go. Any reconciliation, if there was any, now existed only in memory. Dwayne began to understand his father in the way only possible when you're old enough, when you've carried similar responsibilities, when you've lived long enough in the role of provider. He understood that his father's generation was taught to be tough, to survive, that gentleness was once considered a luxury. He understood that love was sometimes wrapped in discipline, because that was the only language they knew. But understanding doesn't erase regret. Understanding doesn't replace the words that were never spoken. Late loss has its own pain. Pain for the possibilities that closed. Not because you'll never meet again, but because there's no more chance to fix things. Dwayne wondered if there were days he was too busy to call, too tired to listen, too confident that there would still be time. That question didn't look for blame, it looked for truth. And the truth is, time doesn't promise anyone anything. In the quieter nights after the funeral, Dwayne faced a realization that stopped him cold. He had become more like his father than he thought. Not in deliberate coldness, but in the habit of enduring in silence, in prioritizing duty over emotion, in loving through actions but slow to speak it. He saw himself in the hard decisions, in the pace that didn't allow weakness, in the caution around vulnerability. That similarity was no longer something to resist. It was something to look straight at in order to transform. His father's death forced Dwayne to re-examine his own moral map. If he had once feared repeating his father, now he understood that repetition isn't fate. Repetition is an unconscious choice. And that choice only changes when it's named. He began saying more of the things he once thought unnecessary. Thank yous, sorries, I love yous. Not as ritual, but as a way of living. Because he had seen the cost of letting words wait too long. The prolonged pain didn't weaken him. It made him more precise. Precise in distinguishing between strength and rigidity. Precise in asking, what's worth keeping? What needs to be let go? He understood that his father did the best he could with what he had, and understood that he himself was doing the same, but with a different set of tools. The difference wasn't in the love, but in the expression. And that expression, Dwayne was determined not to leave to his own children as a puzzle to solve when it was too late. There were mornings he woke up with the familiar emptiness, but this time he didn't try to fill it with work. He allowed the sadness to stay, allowed the memories to run their full course. He sat with his family, told old stories not to sanctify, but to humanize the father who was gone. Because only when the father becomes a full human, with flaws and efforts, can the pain be placed in its proper place. His father's passing left things that were never said. But that very absence became the strongest reminder. Speak while you still can. Show up while you still can. Forgive while you still can. Dwayne carried that lesson not as a burden, but as a compass. He didn't try to fix the past. He chose to fix the present. And in that choice, the late pain gradually transformed into a new kind of responsibility. The responsibility to live, so that the important things aren't pushed to the end when all the doors have already closed. After his father passed away, and the things that were never said became a permanent void, Dwayne Johnson entered the harshest psychological climax of his life, having to be strong for the entire world. Not because he wanted to, but because the world had grown accustomed to leaning on that image. Every day, millions of people waited for him to deliver a word of encouragement, a solid enough statement to get back up, a wide enough smile to believe tomorrow would be okay. He became a public pillar, the man of discipline, of never giving up, of keep pushing forward. But right then, his inner resources were slowly draining, like a tank being emptied non-stop without time to refill. Inspiring others became an invisible duty. Every post, every interview, every appearance carried the expectation to stay in character. No one asked where he was in his own journey. The only question was how far he could pull others along. And he pulling with the memory of discipline, with the habit of endurance, with the survival instinct that had saved him from those $7 years ago. But pulling forever gets tiring. Tiring to the point where even joy has to line up behind responsibility. He wasn't allowed to stop. Stopping meant exposing a crack. He wasn't allowed to be weak. Weakness meant shaking other people's faith. He understood the mechanism perfectly, because he himself had once found strength in the unyielding images of those who came before him. But understanding didn't make the burden lighter. On the contrary, it made him police himself more harshly. Every sign of fatigue had to be suppressed. Every moment of hesitation had to be covered up. The double life reached its peak here. One public life ran smoothly, packed schedules, positive messages, performance without decline. One private life quietly shrank. Silent evenings, sleepless nights, questions he didn't dare voice. He stood between two opposing currents, one demanding he keep giving endlessly, the other calling him to hold something back for himself. And he chose to give, because that was what he knew how to do best. There was a bitter paradox. The man lifting the spirits of millions had nowhere to place his own exhaustion. When you're the icon of strength, admitting depletion can easily be mistaken for betraying the story everyone believes in. So he kept talking about discipline, kept telling stories of getting back up after falls, things that were all true, but never mentioned, that sometimes getting up non-stop has its own cost. He feared that if he said it, the story would lose its power. And if the story lost its power, people would lose their anchor. During this period, the body had already warned him. Family had become his anchor. Loss had opened the door to memory, but the machine still wouldn't let him rest. He learned to fragment himself more finely, the appearing part polished to perfection, the exhausted part tucked away. That refinement kept his performance going, while deepening the gap between the real man and the public image. Not out of dishonesty, but out of survival. There were rare moments between late-night flights, in empty locker rooms, when he wondered if strength always had to mean tensing up, if there was a way to be both an anchor and a human being. But before the question could go far, the schedule pulled him back. He chose to continue because continuing was what he had done for 30 years. And in that choice, he became outstanding to the point that hardly anyone noticed the price. The psychological climax didn't arrive as a dramatic fall. It arrived as the prolonged strain of tension. No explosion, no collapse, just gradual wearing down. And that gradual wearing is the most dangerous, because it doesn't trigger alarms. He still completed everything, still inspired, still smiled. But every smile had to be placed just right, every message calibrated perfectly. By this point, strength was no longer energy. It was the discipline of not being allowed to stop. The world needed him to be strong, that much was true. But the hard truth to say was, no one can be strong for the whole world forever. Dwayne stood on the razor-thin line between those two truths. One side was the responsibility he had accepted. The other was the limit he had reached. The double life hit its peak when both sides demanded the biggest part of him at the same time. And right at that boundary, a change began to stir, not by breaking, but by asking the right question. What could the most enduring strength possibly be, if not endless tensing? That question didn't have an immediate answer, but it opened the first sliver of light after a long chain of years when weakness wasn't permitted. And in that fragile sliver, the man who had once learned to endure began to learn something else, still incomplete, still not easy, but necessary. Strength also has the right to rest, in order to remain strength. After the psychological climax where he had to be strong for the whole world, Dwayne Johnson didn't step into a noisy breakdown moment. There was no shocking announcement, no tears in front of the cameras. The double life closed in the quietest way possible, through exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of one long day, but the gradual wearing down of 30 years living in no weakness allowed mode. Exhaustion to the point where body, mind, and emotions all spoke the same language. Stopping was no longer an option. Stopping was mandatory if he wanted to keep living. No one was fooled. That was the truth he understood better than anyone. He didn't build a fake story. He only told half the story, the half that could help others stand up. The other half, the half of fatigue, doubt, and fear, was kept back not to polish the image, but because no one had ever asked slowly enough. The world was used to receiving energy from him, but rarely stopped to ask the opposite question. And he, so used to giving, rarely allowed himself to receive. The tragic liberation didn't come from confession. It came from permission. Permission to slow down without seeing it as betrayal of discipline. Permission to be imperfect without seeing it as betrayal of the story. Permission to say, I'm not okay today without fearing it would collapse other people's faith. Those permissions sounded small, but for someone who had lived by acceleration, they were page-turning decisions. When he began to slow down, the sounds that had been drowned out started to return. The body spoke more clearly, not just pain, but the need for rest. The mind spoke not just goals, but meaning. Emotions spoke not just motivation, but real tiredness. He didn't try to shut them up. For the first time in a very long while, he stayed with them. No immediate fixing, no optimizing, just listening. The double life closed not because he decided to confess to the public, but because the inner strength to sustain it had run dry. And when inner strength ran dry, the truth became simple. No one can live two lives forever. The price had been paid in full through sleepless nights, surgeries, late losses, civilized but empty goodbyes. Closing, in this case, wasn't shutting a door. It was redrawing boundaries. He began restructuring how he showed up, not disappearing, but appearing less in the old way, not rejecting responsibility, but reallocating energy, not stopping inspiration, but stopping treating inspiration as a daily obligation. There were days he chose silence not because he had nothing left to say, but because silence was what he needed. There were projects he turned down, not out of fear of risk, but out of respect for limits. Most importantly, he stopped equating his self-worth with the ability to tense up. He accepted that enduring strength doesn't lie in always standing tall. It lies in knowing when to sit down. Accepted that the model American man doesn't have to be tireless steel. It can be a human who knows how to rest, how to ask for help, how to tell the truth. And when that truth is lived at the right rhythm, it doesn't weaken the story, it makes the story deeper. The tragic liberation also meant looking back at the past with different eyes. He didn't deny the years of tensing up. He knew they had saved him, but he stopped sanctifying them. Discipline had once been a life raft. Now self-compassion became the foundation. He allowed himself joy in small things, unhurried family meals, light but consistent workouts, conversations with no agenda. Those things didn't make headlines, but they kept him present in life. No one was fooled because the story he told was always true. It just wasn't complete. When the double life closed, the story became fuller, light and shadow, pushing forward and stopping, discipline and gentleness. And in that fullness, listeners didn't lose their anchor. They found a different one, the anchor of humanity. Allowing himself to be imperfect didn't make him smaller. It made him the right size, right for the body that had paid the price, right for the family that stayed, right for the losses that couldn't be undone, right for the man who no longer needed a mask to exist. The double life closed not with applause, but with a long exhale, the exhale of someone who had carried enough and finally set the load down. And when the load came down, he didn't disappear. He stood there, less noisy, less tense, but solid in a new way. Not because the pain was gone, but because he no longer had to hide it. Tragic liberation, in the end, wasn't erasing sadness. It was giving sadness a proper place, so life could keep flowing without breaking the one who carried it. After the double life closed through exhaustion, Dwayne Johnson didn't step into some post-trauma paradise. There was no redemption, no final victory, no swelling music to affirm that every crack had healed. Just an ordinary morning where he woke up with a body still aching, a mind still tired, and a simple truth: I'm still here. Here not as an invincible icon, but as a man who had gone through too many layers of endurance to still need to prove anything. Not being healed doesn't mean failure. It just means life isn't perfect in the way we hoped. The losses don't disappear when we accept them. They stay like scars to remind us the price has been paid. Dwayne understood that. He understood that a childhood without a safe place can't be rewritten. Understood that the moment he pulled his mother back from the highway lanes didn't turn into a perfectly happy ending. Understood that the football dream cut short didn't need an apology from life. Understood that the years of tensing up saved him, but also took away things that can never be restored. And then, after everything, all that's left is what isn't loud. Family unscheduled evenings, small stories, hugs with no reason, acceptance. Not acceptance to stop living, but acceptance to live at the right rhythm. A man who understands what he's been through, not dramatized, not downplayed, just named correctly, understands that strength was once necessary armor, but armor can't be worn forever. Understands that some days, the best days, are the ones where nothing has to be proven. There is no final victory because real life doesn't close chapters with fireworks. It closes with quiet endurance, with continuing to wake up, continuing to show up, continuing to speak truthfully when possible. Dwayne no longer tries to turn every pain into a lesson for others. He lets a portion of the pain remain his own, because some things don't need to be shared to have value. Some things just need to be lived with, kindly. Family didn't heal him. Family kept him here. Here in life, when the lights go out. Here in lighter but more consistent workouts. Here in responsibilities rearranged so they don't swallow the man whole. Here with memories of his father no longer to resist, but to understand. Understand that he is like his father in more ways than he once thought, and different from his father in one decisive way. He won't let the important things wait until it's too late. Acceptance is not surrender. It is setting the load down in the right place. No longer equating self-worth with pace. No longer seeing rest as betrayal of discipline. No longer viewing weakness as a flaw to hide. Acceptance allows him to become the right size, just enough for the body, just enough for the mind, just enough for the relationships that need breathing room. The man was not healed, because no one can go back to fix the years that have passed. But that man survived not by winning everything, but by not leaving himself behind. Survived by learning how to stop, by learning how to say, enough, by learning how to let ordinary days carry meaning. If there is a quiet legacy here, it isn't box office numbers or titles. It is a way of living, strong when needed, gentle when possible, disciplined to stand firm, compassionate to stay. Dwayne Johnson didn't become someone else. He became a version of himself that can breathe. And in a world that often glorifies speed over depth, that is a courageous choice. A quiet ending doesn't give us the feeling of closure. It leaves a resonance like a lingering low note. No redemption to believe in, no victory to cheer. Just a truth, wide enough to stand inside without breaking. Family is there. Acceptance is there. And a man who has been through it, paid the price, understood as continuing to live, slower, truer, and without a mask. Looking back at the entire story of Dwayne Johnson, the emotion that remains isn't the overwhelm of fame, but a quiet ache for a man who had to tense up for too long to be worthy of other people's belief. From a childhood without a safe place, a strict father who loved through discipline, to the moment at 15 pulling his mother back from the highway lanes, Dwayne learned early a brutal lesson: stay silent to survive. When the football dream collapsed, $7 in his pocket wasn't just material poverty, it was identity emptiness. WWE, and later Hollywood, weren't simply success. They were armor to cover the fear of abandonment and the feeling of worthlessness that had followed him from very early on. The most heartbreaking thing in the story isn't the injuries, the surgeries, or the silent divorce, but that a man who became a source of motivation for millions of Americans wasn't allowed to be weak. When his father passed, when his body betrayed him, when his inner world ran dry, he still had to step out and talk about discipline, about never giving up, because society had grown used to leaning on that image. His double life wasn't deception. It was the consequence of a culture that celebrates strength, but rarely asks, "Are you okay?" The lesson for real American life lies in that very quiet ending. Success doesn't equal healing. Strength isn't always tensing up. Family, presence, and allowing yourself to be imperfect are the truly enduring anchors. Dwayne Johnson's story reminds us that the greatest courage of a grown person isn't enduring forever. It's knowing when to stop, so you can keep living. If Dwayne Johnson's journey of silent survival touched you, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue listening together to the strong but cracked lives behind the spotlight. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video where we keep talking about imperfect people who have bravely kept going.